In the beginning, there was nothing. Not the nothing of an empty room, but the profound nothing of Ginnungagap, the yawning void that existed before thought, before breath, before the first spark of possibility. This great emptiness stretched between two primordial realms. Muspel in the south, a land of dancing flames so fierce that only fire giants could endure them, and Niflheim in the north, wrapped in eternal ice and mist. Welcome, gentle wanderers, to our quiet corner of the digital realm, where ancient whispers meet modern rest. Here at Nocturnia Chronicles, we believe the most profound stories are told not with thunder, but with the soft rustle of turning pages in a midnight library. Tonight, we journey to the misty halls of Norse mythology, where gods walked between worlds and wisdom was carved in runes upon the world tree itself. So settle into your most comfortable position, perhaps adjust your pillow once more, and let your breathing slow as we explore together. Before we begin, if these gentle tales bring you peace, a simple like helps other souls find their way to our quiet gathering. And should you wish to join our community of dreamers and listeners, that subscribe button awaits. No pressure, only invitation. Now, let us step through the veils of time, to when the world was young and magic flowed like morning mist through the branches of Yggdrasil. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of this cosmic chasm. The silence would be absolute, yet somehow pregnant with potential. As the cold breath from Niflheim met the scorching winds from Muspel, something extraordinary happened in that space between. Frost formed and melted and formed again, creating the first drizzling rains that would pool in the depths of the void. From this unlikely marriage of ice and fire emerged Yma, the first giant, born not of parents but of necessity, of the universe's need to fill its own emptiness. Yma was neither good nor evil in our understanding. He simply was a force as natural as gravity or time. And beside him, carved from the same primordial meeting of opposites, came Aurombla, a cow of impossible size and gentle nature, whose warm tongue would soon reshape the very foundations of reality. While Yma slept in those early days of existence, sustained by Aurombla's milk, his body performed its own quiet magic. From his armpits emerged the first frost giants, not the monstrous beings of later tales, but primordial forces representing the raw, untamed aspects of nature. His feet, pressed together in sleep, gave birth to more giants, creating a race that would forever embody the wild, unpredictable essence of the natural world. Meanwhile, Aurombla's rough tongue worked steadily against the salt-crusted ice, licking and warming, revealing something profound beneath the frozen surface. On the first day, hair appeared. On the second, a head. By the third day, she had freed an entire man. Buri, the ancestor of the gods, beautiful and strong and wise. Buri's son was Bor, and Bor took as his wife Bestla, one of the giant-born. This union, god blood and giant blood intertwining, would create the fundamental tension that would define all of Norse mythology. Their children were three brothers whose names still echo through modern days of the week: Odin, Vili, and Ve. These three brothers looked upon the sleeping Yma and saw not just a giant, but raw material for creation itself. What followed was not murder in any human sense, but transformation, the conscious decision to turn chaotic potential into ordered reality. They lifted Yma's vast body and began the work of world-building, each part becoming a fundamental element of existence. His flesh became Midgard, the middle realm where humans would one day walk and dream and tell stories around their fires. His blood filled the oceans and lakes, flowing with the same life force that had once sustained him. His bones became the mountains, rising like the ribs of some great sleeping creature, and his skull formed the sky itself, held aloft at its four corners by industrious dwarfs named North, south, east, and west. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was Yma's brain, scattered across the sky to become the clouds that drift and dance and bring rain to nourish the worlds below. Even his eyebrows found purpose, formed into a protective wall around Midgard to keep the chaos of giants at bay. Though this wall was more invitation than barrier, suggesting safety rather than demanding it. The brothers gathered sparks from Muspel's realm and set them as stars in their new sky, creating patterns that would guide travelers and mark the passage of seasons. The sun and moon they set in motion, chased eternally by wolves whose howling adds drama to each sunset and dawn. Time itself began to flow in measured beats, rather than the endless, shapeless duration of the void. In the center of this new creation, the brothers planted Yggdrasil, the world tree, an ash so mighty that its roots reached down to the wells of wisdom and fate, while its branches touched the highest heavens. 9 realms hung like fruit from its limbs. Asgard for the gods, Midgard for humans, Jotunheim for giants, Alfheim for elves, and others besides, each connected yet distinct, each adding its own note to the cosmic song. But even as they shaped physical reality, the brothers knew their creation needed inhabitants capable of consciousness, of choice, of growth. Walking along a seashore in their new world, they found 2 trees, an ash and an elm, and saw in their wooden stillness the perfect vessels for sentient life. Odin breathed into them the gift of spirit and life. Vili granted them reason and movement, the ability to think and choose and wonder. Ve gave them speech and the senses, the capacity to hear music and taste sweetness and feel the warmth of sunlight on their skin. The ash became Ask, the first man, and the elm became Embla, the first woman, and they awakened in a world already rich with possibility. These first humans were neither primitive nor innocent. They were gifted from birth with the full capacity for wisdom, creativity, and connection. The gods had learned from their own mixed heritage of order and chaos. They created humans with free will, knowing this gift would lead to both beauty and sorrow, triumph and failure. As our first section draws to a close, we see the cosmos settling into its new rhythms. The gods established their Hall of Gladsheim in Asgard, with its silver roof and golden seats for each deity. They built Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where heroes would feast and fight in preparation for the final battle still to come. They created the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, allowing passage between realms while maintaining the distinctness of each world. Yet even in these early days of creation, the threads of fate were already weaving their complex patterns. The Norns, past, present, and future, sat by the well of fate beneath Yggdrasil's roots, spinning destinies for gods and mortals alike. Their work suggested that even the gods themselves were subject to forces greater than individual will, bound by patterns that were both chosen and inevitable. And here, dear listeners, we pause at the threshold of greater mysteries. For the gods, having created the world, must now learn to live in it. And living, as any of us knows, is far more complex than creating. What shadows would their choices cast? What price would wisdom demand? What happens when gods discover they, too, are mortal? Now that the world had found its shape and rhythm, we turn our attention to Odin, whose hunger for wisdom would define not just his own fate, but the character of the entire cosmos. Unlike the distant, all-knowing deities of some mythologies, Odin was a seeker, driven by an insatiable curiosity that would lead him to sacrifice comfort, safety, and even his own eye in pursuit of understanding. In the halls of Asgard, Odin ruled not as a tyrant, but as a wanderer who happened to wear a crown. One-eyed wolf and raven-flanked, with his spear Gungnir always at hand, he pursued knowledge throughout the 9 realms. His ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew each day across all the worlds, returning at evening to whisper into his ears everything they had seen and heard. But even this vast network of information could not satisfy Odin's deeper need. There were mysteries that required personal sacrifice to unlock, truths that could only be purchased with pain. The greatest of these was the secret of the runes. Not mere letters for writing, but symbols containing the fundamental patterns that governed reality itself. In an act of self-sacrifice that would become legendary, Odin hung himself upside down for 9 days and nights on Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, to gain knowledge of the runic alphabet. Imagine the scene: the All-Father, suspended between life and death, neither eating nor drinking, while the world tree swayed gently in cosmic winds. For 9 days, he gazed down into the depths where the Norns sat spinning fate. For 9 nights, he endured the growing weakness of his body, while his spirit reached toward truths just beyond mortal comprehension. On the 9th day, as his vision began to fade and his heartbeat grew erratic, the runes finally revealed themselves, not as letters scratched on stone, but as living patterns of power flowing through the roots and branches of existence itself. With a cry that shook the branches of Yggdrasil, Odin grasped the runes and made them his own. But this was not theft, it was transformation. By accepting the knowledge, he also accepted the responsibility that came with it. He would share these symbols with mortals, giving humanity the tools to record their stories, their laws, their deepest thoughts. Yet he knew that every gift of knowledge also carries the burden of choice. The runes Odin discovered were far more than an alphabet. Each symbol contained multiple layers of meaning. A letter, yes, but also a concept, a force, a piece of the fundamental structure of reality. Fehu represented cattle and wealth, but also the flowing energy of prosperity and abundance. Thurasas meant giant, but also the necessary force of chaos that prevents stagnation. Ansuz bore Odin's own name and represented divine inspiration, the moment when wisdom sparks into consciousness. But Odin's quest for wisdom did not end with the runes. His missing eye, the price he paid to drink from Mimir's well of wisdom, had taught him that knowledge often requires surrender. At that ancient well beneath Yggdrasil's roots, where Mimir's severed head continued to speak prophecies, Odin had made his bargain gladly. Physical sight for inner vision, the ability to see surfaces for the power to perceive depths. This exchange reveals something profound about the Norse understanding of wisdom. It is not simply accumulation of facts, but a transformation of perception itself. Odin's remaining eye saw differently after his sacrifice. Not less, but more truly. He could perceive the threads of fate, the hidden connections between seemingly separate events, the patterns that would unfold across generations. From Mimir's well, Odin learned of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, and discovered that even he was not eternal. This knowledge might have crushed a lesser being, but Odin found it liberating. Knowing that his time was limited, he determined to use it well. He would gather the wisest and bravest humans to Valhalla, preparing for a final battle that would end one age of the world and birth another. The Einherjar, the chosen slain, came to Valhalla not as punishment for dying in battle, but as honor for living with courage. Each day they fought, honing their skills for the coming conflict. Each evening they feasted together, their wounds healed, their friendship deepened. This was Odin's gift to warriors, the promise that their bravery would serve a purpose greater than their individual lives. Yet Odin was also a god of poetry and inspiration, understanding that wisdom takes many forms. He appeared to mortals sometimes as an old wanderer with a staff and broad-brimmed hat, asking for shelter or sharing stories by the fire. In these encounters, he often taught through riddles and tales rather than direct instruction, knowing that wisdom earned through puzzle-solving lasts longer than wisdom simply given. The story of how Odin acquired the mead of poetry reveals his cleverness and his willingness to transform himself for knowledge. When the dwarfs Vjala and Gala killed the wise Kvesa and brewed his blood into a mead that granted poetic inspiration to whoever drank it, Odin knew he must possess this treasure. But it was guarded by the giant Suttinger in an impenetrable mountain. Odin's solution was characteristically indirect. He disguised himself as a worker named Bolverk and labored for Suttinger's brother Bogi for an entire summer, doing the work of 9 men. His only payment was to be a single drink of the mead. When Bogi tried to renege on the deal, Odin convinced him to drill a hole into the mountain. Then, transforming himself into a serpent, Odin slithered through the narrow opening. Inside the mountain, he found Suttinger's daughter Gunnel guarding the precious mead. For 3 nights, Odin courted her, and she allowed him 3 drinks. But these were no ordinary sips. In 3 draughts, Odin emptied all 3 vats, then transformed into an eagle and flew toward Asgard with the mead in his gullet. Suttinger, also taking eagle form, pursued him across the sky. In his haste to escape, Odin spat some of the mead backward, and this portion fell to earth, becoming the inspiration available to bad poets and braggarts. But the greater portion he brought safely to the gods, and from this came true poetic inspiration, the kind that reveals deep truths about the human condition and touches the divine spark within mortal hearts. This tale illustrates several key aspects of Odin's character: his willingness to work and wait for what he desired, his ability to see potential in every situation, and his understanding that wisdom often comes disguised as other things. The mead of poetry was not just about creating beautiful verses. It was about the power to speak truth in ways that could change hearts and minds. In his wanderings, Odin also learned the art of seed, a form of magic associated primarily with the Norse Gods and often practiced by women. This required him to set aside the masculine pride that might have prevented a god of war from learning what some considered feminine arts. Through seed, he gained the ability to see the future, to influence fate, and to journey between the worlds in spirit form. These journeys taught him that the boundaries between realms were more fluid than they appeared. A wise ruler needed to understand not just his own domain, but the forces and perspectives of giants, elves, dwarfs, and mortals. Each group had their own wisdom to offer, their own role in the cosmic balance. As we complete this section, we see Odin not as a distant deity demanding worship, but as a seeker whose example reminds us that growth never ends. His willingness to sacrifice, to learn, to change himself in pursuit of understanding would soon draw him into the most painful lesson of all: the discovery that even gods cannot protect what they love most from the inexorable turning of fate's wheel. While Odin sought wisdom across the 9 realms, another figure sat at the heart of Asgard's power, one whose knowledge was perhaps even greater than his, though she chose to keep it locked within her heart. Frigg, whose name means beloved, was not merely Odin's wife but the highest ranking of the Asgard goddesses, associated with love, marriage, fertility, family, and foresight. Yet in her lay a profound paradox. She could see the future but told no one. Frigg dwelt in her wetland halls of Fensala, a place of mists and marshes where the boundaries between known and unknown became as fluid as the standing water itself. Here, surrounded by reeds that whispered secrets and reflected fragmentary images of what was to come, she spun the threads of fate alongside the Norns. Though whether she guided those threads or merely observed their patterns remained her own mystery. Imagine the weight of such knowledge. To know not just tomorrow's weather or next season's harvest, but the great turning points of history, the moments when love would triumph or fail, when heroes would rise or fall, when entire worlds would live or die. Because of her wisdom, Odin often sought her advice in difficult decisions, yet she shared only what she deemed necessary, keeping the fuller picture veiled behind her gentle smile. This selective sharing was not cruelty, but compassion. Frigg understood that some knowledge, given too early or too completely, could destroy the very thing it sought to protect. Better to guide gently, to offer comfort and counsel without removing the freedom to choose. Her silence was not emptiness but fullness, the profound quiet of someone who has seen too much to speak carelessly. Her daily life in Asgard reflected this complex nature. As Queen of the Gods, she presided over matters of home and hearth, teaching the divine arts of spinning, weaving, and household management. But these were not mere domestic duties. In Norse society, the spindle and loom were tools of power, used to create not just cloth, but the very fabric of social relationships. A good weaving could bind communities together. A poor one could unravel them. Frigg's handmaidens reflected different aspects of her nature and domain. Fulla carried her jewelry box and knew all her secrets, a reminder that even queens need confidants. Gna rode the swift horse Hofvarpner across sky and sea, carrying Frigg's messages between the worlds. Hlyn protected those whom Frigg wished to shield from harm, extending the goddess's protective influence throughout the realms. But it was through her relationship with her son Balder that Frigg's character was most fully revealed. Balder the Beautiful, god of light and purity, beloved by all who met him. From his birth, Frigg had sensed the shadow that would fall across his path. Her prophetic sight showed her not just his radiant life, but also his terrible death, and the grief that would follow in its wake. In the poem Baldur's Drama, we see Frigg portrayed as actively acting to change the course of fate, as she first asks all things in the world to spare her son Balder. This was no simple maternal worry, but a cosmic intervention. The Queen of the Gods traveling to every corner of existence, securing oaths from fire and water, iron and stone, plants and animals, diseases and poisons, that none would harm her precious son. The scene is both touching and terrible in its implications. Picture Frigg moving through the worlds with desperate purpose, her royal dignity maintained even as her heart broke with each oath secured. She spoke to ancient oaks and newborn streams, to the forge fires of the dwarfs and the ice palaces of the giants. She knelt before tiny flowers and mighty dragons alike, securing their promises with the same careful attention. Almost everything agreed to her plea. How could they refuse when she came not as a demanding queen, but as a frightened mother? Fire promised not to burn Balder, water not to drown him, metals not to cut him. Even diseases and wild beasts swore oaths to leave him unharmed. The world itself conspired to protect the god of light and joy. Almost everything. In her thoroughness, Frigg overlooked one small plant, the mistletoe, growing quietly on an oak tree west of Valhalla. It seemed so insignificant, too young and weak to pose any threat. This oversight would prove fatal, for it provided Loki with the weapon he needed to bring about Balder's doom. The protection Frigg had woven around her son had an unexpected consequence. It made Balder invulnerable to all the usual forms of harm, turning violence against him into a game. The gods would gather in their assembly and throw weapons at Balder for sport, watching them bounce harmlessly away while he stood laughing at the center of their circle. What had been meant as ultimate protection became, in the hands of fate, the very mechanism of destruction. Loki, ever the agent of necessary chaos, discovered the one gap in Frigg's perfect plan. Disguising himself as an old woman, he visited her in Fensala and, through careful questioning, learned about the overlooked mistletoe. Armed with this knowledge, he fashioned a dart from the humble plant and placed it in the hands of Hr, Balder's blind brother. The moment of Balder's death was both inevitable and shocking. As the gods played their familiar game, Loki guided Hr's hand, helping him aim the mistletoe dart. When it struck Balder, instead of bouncing away harmlessly, it pierced his heart. The god of light fell dead, and with him fell the first shadow of Ragnarok across the golden halls of Asgard. Frigg's response to this tragedy revealed the full depth of her character. Her first reaction was not rage but action. She immediately asked who among the gods would ride to Hel's realm to bargain for Baldur's return. When Herma volunteered for this perilous journey, she provided him with Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir and her own blessing for the road. But her greater response was grief itself, elevated to cosmic significance. When bargaining failed, and Hel demanded that all things weep for Baldur to prove he was truly loved, Frigg's sorrow became the template for universal mourning. She wept, and her tears became the model for all tears of loss. Every mother who would ever mourn a child, every lover who would grieve a beloved, every human who would feel the sharp pain of death's separation, all were connected to Frigg's profound sorrow. The only thing that refused to weep was KK, an old giantess who was likely Loki in disguise. Her refusal meant Baldur would remain in Hel until after Ragnarok, when he and his brother Hr would be reconciled in the new world that would rise from the ashes of the old. Through this tragedy, Frigg learned the hardest lesson of all, that love, however deep, cannot always prevent loss. Her perfect knowledge of the future had included this moment, yet she had fought against it with every tool at her disposal. Her failure was not a lack of power, but a collision with the fundamental nature of existence itself. That growth requires change, and change inevitably includes endings. Yet Frigg's story does not end in despair. After Baldur's death, she became a different kind of goddess, still the queen of Asgard, still the wise counselor, but now also the divine embodiment of grief transformed into wisdom. Her sorrow was not meaningless but generative, creating new forms of compassion and understanding. In the time after Baldur's death, Frigg's role in Asgard subtly shifted. She became the goddess to whom mortals turned in their darkest hours, the one who understood that love and loss were inseparable, that protecting something precious sometimes required letting it go. Her silence about the future took on new meaning, not withholding but accepting that some things must unfold in their own time and way. The other gods began to see her differently too. Where once her knowledge might have seemed like a burden or a puzzle, now it was recognized as a form of service. She bore the weight of knowing, so that others could live more freely in the present moment. Her choice to speak or remain silent was always made in service of the greater good, even when that good required temporary suffering. And here, dear listeners, we see that wisdom and sorrow are often intertwined, that the deepest knowledge comes not from books or teachers, but from love tested by loss. Frigg's journey from protective mother to wise mourner would echo through every realm, preparing the way for the final chapters of the god's story. Chapters written not in triumph, but in transformation. Now we must speak of perhaps the most complex figure in the Norse pantheon, one who defies simple categorization, and whose very nature embodies the contradictions at the heart of existence itself. Loki, whose name may derive from the Old Norse word for fire, or possibly to close, was neither fully god nor giant, neither entirely friend nor enemy to the Aesir. He was the necessary catalyst, the agent of change who made growth possible precisely because he made stagnation impossible. Unlike the other gods, who had clear domains and consistent natures, Loki was pure potential, a being capable of becoming anything the situation required. This shape-shifting ability went far beyond the physical. It was a fundamental fluidity of identity that allowed him to be simultaneously creator and destroyer, helper and hindrance, male and female, wise counselor and fool. His parentage reflected this liminal nature. Son of the giant Farboti, cruel striker, and Laufey, leafy isle. Loki carried giant blood in his veins, yet lived among the gods as Odin's blood brother. This relationship was not mere friendship, but a mystical bond that made them, in some sense, two aspects of the same cosmic principle. Odin the seeker of wisdom and order, Loki the bringer of chaos and change. The blood brotherhood ritual, they had performed in the early days of the world bound them so completely that Odin swore never to drink ale unless it was offered to Loki as well. This was no casual promise, but a recognition that wisdom without change becomes rigid, just as change without wisdom becomes destruction. They needed each other to function fully, a truth that would become both their greatest strength and their ultimate tragedy. Loki's shape-shifting abilities were legendary throughout the 9 realms. He could become a fly to slip through the smallest crack, a salmon to swim the deepest rivers, a mare to lead stallions astray, or an old woman to gather gossip and secrets. But his transformations were never arbitrary. Each form served a specific purpose in the great web of causation that connected all things. Consider the time when the gods needed to retrieve Thor's hammer from the giant Thrmr, who had stolen it and demanded Freya as bride price for its return. While Thor raged and Freya refused, Loki saw the solution that others missed. He suggested Thor disguise himself as a bride, and he himself would serve as the bridesmaid. The scene that followed was pure comedy, Thor struggling to act feminine, while Loki smoothly explained away his bride's enormous appetite and fierce gaze to the increasingly suspicious giants. This tale reveals Loki's genius for seeing beyond conventional categories. Where others saw only impossible obstacles, he perceived fluid possibilities. Gender roles, social expectations, divine dignity, all were tools to be used when helpful and discarded when they became limitations. His willingness to embrace any form necessary to solve problems made him invaluable to the gods, even as it made him unpredictable. But Loki's transformations were not always voluntary or pleasant. When he had led the stallion Svalfari away from his work on Asgard's wall, to prevent the gods from having to pay the giant builder his promised fee, Loki took the form of a mare. What he had not anticipated was that Svalfari would catch him, and from their union would come Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse who became Odin's mount. This experience, being forced into a female role, becoming pregnant, giving birth, profoundly shaped Loki's understanding of power and vulnerability. He learned intimately what it meant to be acted upon rather than acting, to have one's body become the site of another's will. This knowledge would inform his later actions, both his empathy for those who suffered and his rage against those who inflicted suffering. Sleipnir himself became a bridge between realms, capable of carrying riders across the rainbow bridge Bifrost, down to the realm of the dead, or up to the highest branches of Yggdrasil. In giving birth to this miraculous horse, Loki had inadvertently created one of the most powerful tools the gods possessed, a creature who could travel where others could not, see what others could not see, connect what others left separate. The story of Sleipnir's birth also reveals another crucial aspect of Loki's nature, his ability to create through destruction and destruction through creation. By sabotaging the giants' work on Asgard's wall, he had saved the gods from an impossible bargain. But in doing so, he had exposed himself to violation and trauma. The gift he ultimately gave them, Sleipnir, was born from his suffering, making it both precious and painful. Loki's other children would prove even more significant to the fate of the cosmos. With the giantess Angerboa, he fathered 3 beings who embodied the forces that would ultimately bring about Ragnarok. Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world serpent, and Hel, half-dead goddess of the underworld. When the gods learned of these children through prophecy, their response revealed both their wisdom and their fatal flaw. They recognized the danger these offspring represented, but their solution, attempting to contain or control them, only ensured that the prophecies would come to pass. Fenrir they tried to bind, teaching him that gods could not be trusted. Jormungandr they cast into the ocean, where he grew large enough to encircle Midgard. Hel they banished to the realm of the dead, where she gained dominion over all who died of sickness or old age. In each case, the gods' fear created the very outcome they sought to prevent. By treating Loki's children as enemies before they had committed any hostile acts, the gods transformed potential allies into actual adversaries. This pattern would repeat throughout the mythological cycle. Prophecy creating the conditions for its own fulfillment through the very attempts to prevent it. Loki watched his children's treatment with growing bitterness. He understood the gods' fear, but he also saw their hypocrisy. They accepted him despite his giant blood, yet rejected his offspring for theirs. They praised his cleverness when it served their purposes, but condemned the same quality in his children. This double standard slowly poisoned his loyalty to Asgard. The relationship between Loki and the other gods began to shift as the cosmos aged. In the early days, his trickery had usually served beneficial purposes. Retrieving Thor's hammer, acquiring treasures for the gods, solving seemingly impossible problems through lateral thinking. But as time passed and the shadows of Ragnarok grew longer, his interventions became more disruptive, his solutions more costly. The theft of Sif's golden hair provides a perfect example of this transition. When Loki cut off Thor's wife's beautiful locks as a prank, the thunder god's rage was swift and terrible. To make amends, Loki journeyed to Svartalfheim and commissioned the Dark Elves to create new hair of spun gold that would be even more beautiful than the original. But Loki being Loki, he could not resist turning this simple transaction into a complex game. He bet two groups of dwarfs against each other, claiming that the sons of Ivaldi, who had made Sif's hair, were more skilled than the brothers Brokkr and Eitri. The result was a crafting contest that produced some of the gods' most precious treasures. Odin's spear Gungnir, his ring Draupnir, Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Freya's golden boar, and Freya's ship Sklanir. Yet even this apparently beneficial outcome came with a cost. When Brokkr and Eitri won the contest and came to claim Loki's head as their prize, he argued that they could take his head but not his neck. And since it was impossible to separate the two, they could have neither. Instead, they sewed his lips shut with magical thread, punishing his clever words. Though Loki eventually freed himself, the experience taught him that even his verbal dexterity had limits. As Loki aged and his relationships with the gods grew more strained, his shape-shifting began to reflect his internal transformation. Where once he had changed form to help or to hide, now he often transformed to hurt or to escape consequences. His fluidity, once a source of creative solutions, became a means of avoiding responsibility. The death of Balder marked the point of no return in Loki's relationship with the gods. His role in the beloved god's death, providing the mistletoe weapon and guiding HRS hand, was seen as unforgivable by the other deities. Yet from Loki's perspective, he had simply performed his cosmic function, bringing about the change that was necessary, even if unwelcome. After Balder's death, when all things were asked to weep to secure his return from hell, Loki took the form of the giantess KK and refused. His justification was coldly logical. Let hell hold what she has. Death, he implied, was part of the natural order, and attempts to circumvent it only created greater problems later. This refusal sealed his fate. The gods' grief and rage demanded a target, and Loki, already suspect because of his role in Balder's death, became the focus of their need for revenge. They hunted him across the 9 realms until he was finally captured at the waterfall where he had hidden in the form of a salmon. In the hushed moments before dawn breaks, when the world holds its breath between night and day, we come to the final movement of our cosmic symphony. This is Ragnarok, not merely an ending, but a transformation so profound that it redefines the very meaning of existence. The word itself means twilight of the gods, or fate of the gods, but like so many Norse concepts, it carries layers of meaning that simple translation cannot capture. The signs of Ragnarok had been building for generations. Not sudden catastrophes, but gradual changes that those who knew how to read them could recognize. The Fimbulwinter, the terrible winter that would last for 3 years without relief, had begun its approach. Brothers would turn against brothers, fathers against sons, as the bonds that held society together frayed and snapped. The very moral fabric of the cosmos was unraveling, preparing the way for complete renewal. Loki's punishment had set many of these events in motion. The gods had bound him beneath the earth with the entrails of his own son Narfi, transformed into unbreakable chains. Above his face, they positioned a venomous serpent whose poison would drip eternally onto his features, causing him agony so intense that his writhing would create earthquakes throughout all the realms. Yet even in this torment, we see the complexity of Norse morality. Loki's wife Sigyn sat beside him with a bowl, catching the poison drops to ease his suffering. When the bowl filled and she had to empty it, the few drops that fell would cause him to convulse in pain, shaking the very foundations of the world. Here was love persisting through the ultimate trial. A giant-born goddess choosing to share her husband's punishment rather than abandon him to face it alone. This image of Sigyn's loyalty becomes one of the most poignant in all of Norse mythology. Day after day, year after year, she sat in the darkness holding her bowl, knowing that her vigil would end only when the world itself ended. Her love was not blind. She understood what Loki had done, the role he had played in Baldur's death. Yet she chose compassion over judgment, presence over abandonment. As the Fimbulwinter deepened, the creatures that would bring about the final battle began to stir. Fenrir, now grown beyond all proportion in his binding, gnawed constantly at his chains. His sons, Skoll and Hati, chased the sun and moon across the sky with increasing speed and hunger, bringing darkness closer with each passing day. In the depths of the ocean, Jormungand, the world serpent, began to turn, his movements poisoning the seas and causing tsunamis that would flood the lowest lands. The gods themselves prepared for what they knew must come. In Valhalla, the Einherjar trained more fiercely than ever, their daily battles taking on new urgency. They were no longer practicing for practice's sake, but preparing for a conflict that would determine whether order or chaos would shape the next cycle of existence. Each warrior understood that they might not survive, but they also knew their courage would help decide what kind of world would emerge from the ashes. Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, stood at his post on the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost with heightened alertness. His horn Gyllenhaal lay ready beside him, waiting for the moment when he would sound the call that would summon every god, giant, elf, and dwarf to the final battle. His ability to see across all the realms made him both the gods' early warning system and their last hope for coordinated response. The approach of Ragnarok also awakened powers that had long slumbered. Surt, the fire giant who had guarded Muspel since the beginning of time, began to march northward with his flaming sword, ready to fulfill his role as the cosmic cleanser. His flames would burn away not just the current world, but all the accumulated grudges, mistakes, and imbalances that had made renewal necessary. When the final battle finally began, it started not with a single dramatic moment, but with a cascade of events, each triggering the next like stones in an avalanche. Loki finally broke free from his bonds, his rage at his treatment transforming him from occasional troublemaker into active enemy of the gods. His children, too, fulfilled their prophetic roles. Fenrir breaking his chains with a roar that shattered mountains, Jormungand rising from the ocean floor with poison dripping from his massive jaws. The battle itself was both cosmic and personal, fought simultaneously on the grand scale of universal forces and the intimate level of individual relationships. Odin faced Fenrir, the wolf he had helped create through his fear and harsh treatment. Thor battled Jormungand, the serpent whose venom would kill the thunder god even as he slew the beast. Heimdall and Loki, once allies in the early days of the world, turned their accumulated grievances into mortal combat. Each of these confrontations carried the weight of the entire mythological cycle. When Odin fell to Fenrir's jaws, it was not just the death of a god, but the acknowledgement that even the wisest cannot control all outcomes. When Thor destroyed Jormungand but died from its poison, it demonstrated that victory and defeat are often indistinguishable. When Heimdall and Loki killed each other, it showed that old friendships, once broken, can become the bitterest enmities. Yet Ragnarok was not purely destructive. Even as the old world burned, survivors began to emerge from hiding places where they had waited out the catastrophe. Lif and Ulfresa, whose names mean life and eager for life, had sheltered within Yggdrasil itself, sustained by morning dew. They would become the ancestors of humanity in the world to come, carrying forward the best of what had been, while leaving behind the worst. Among the gods, too, there were survivors. Baldr and Hr returned from Hel's realm, their ancient quarrel resolved by death and rebirth. Vidar, Odin's son who had avenged his father by killing Fenrir, lived on to help build the new order. Thor's sons Mi and Magni inherited their father's Hamamjolnir, ensuring that the power to protect the innocent would continue into the new age. These survivors did not emerge unchanged from their trials. They carried within them the wisdom that had been purchased at such a terrible price. The understanding that power without compassion becomes tyranny, that order without flexibility becomes stagnation, that even gods must sometimes die for new life to flourish. The new world that rose from Ragnarok's ashes was both familiar and transformed. Iavor, the plain where the gods had once played with their golden game pieces, bloomed again with green grass and flowing streams. But the games played there would be different, less concerned with power and more with harmony, less focused on individual glory and more on collective flourishing. In this renewal, we see the deep wisdom of the Norse worldview. Ragnarok was not a punishment but a necessity, not a failure but a completion. The old world had grown rigid in its patterns, locked into cycles of violence and revenge that prevented true growth. Only by allowing everything to burn could space be cleared for something genuinely new to take root. The gods who died in Ragnarok were not failures but sacrifices, giving up their individual existence so that the principles they represented could be reborn in purer form. Odin's death allowed wisdom to become less hoarded and more shared. Thor's sacrifice meant that strength could be used more for protection and less for domination. Even Loki's apparent villainy served the greater good, providing the catalyst necessary for transformation. The Norse understanding of time was cyclical rather than linear. Each ending was also a beginning, each death a preparation for new birth. The gods, giants, humans, and other beings who populated their cosmos were all part of an eternal dance of creation, preservation, and destruction that would continue as long as existence itself persisted. This cyclical view offered profound comfort to those who lived in a harsh world where death was always near and comfort rarely guaranteed. It suggested that nothing was ever truly lost, that even the most devastating defeats contained within them the seeds of future victories. The courage to face Ragnarok, whether cosmic or personal, came from knowing that endings and beginnings were part of the same eternal process. As our long journey through the Norse cosmos draws to its close, we return to where we began, with the understanding that the greatest stories are not those that provide easy answers, but those that ask deeper questions. The gods of Asgard were not perfect beings to be worshipped without thought, but complex characters whose struggles mirror our own. Their failures and triumphs, their wisdom and folly, their love and loss, all serve as mirrors in which we can recognize our own humanity. In Frigg's protective love and inevitable grief, we see every parent's experience of nurturing what they cannot ultimately shield from harm. In Odin's restless seeking, we recognize our own hunger for meaning and understanding. In Loki's transformations and ultimate binding, we confront the shadow aspects of change and growth that we would rather avoid but cannot escape. And in Ragnarok itself, we find perhaps the most profound teaching of all, that nothing lasts forever, and that this impermanence is not a curse but a gift. It means that no matter how dark the current situation, it will pass. No matter how established any system seems, it can be transformed. No matter how final any ending appears, it contains within it the possibility of new beginning. The Norse gods live on not because they were immortal, they were not, but because the truths they embodied are eternal. As long as beings exist who struggle with questions of power and responsibility, wisdom and ignorance, love and loss, the gods of Asgard will have something to teach us about the art of living fully in an imperfect world.